origins of Assassin's Creed Syndicate are quite similar to Assassin's Creed 4. After a controversial and widely maligned entry, the series was once again flirting with decline. And Ubisoft once again needed a crowd pleaser, and Syndicate was supposed to be that crowd pleaser. It went for a very popular setting, Victorian London, and in every way it could distance itself from Unity, streamlined out all the chuff that made Unity quite so annoying for me personally. The difference is that while Black Flag is a fan favourite, Syndicate is a firmly middle-of-the-pack entry in most people's estimations. Not necessarily bad, but not one that really stands out either. And that's not exactly surprising. Syndicate does not want you to think too hard about it. Syndicate only wants to be a fun video game. And it is a fun video game. That's it. That's the end of the sentence. There's nothing lingering at the end of that statement. Don't worry about it. I like Assassin's Creed Syndicate. I just want to get out ahead of that. I think as a video game, it's fun and I have a good time playing it. Certainly a lot more than Unity. Although I do feel morally obligated to tell you that, like Unity, I did have to delete all my save data before restarting the game, because we're still doing that apparently. Syndicate takes the good ideas of Unity, like the stealth mechanics, and streamlines them into something actually functional. It cuts and changes the stuff that wasn't working, like the combat or the progression system, and replaces them with something that does work. Syndicate is, on a purely mechanical level, one of the tightest games in the series, and that's what's so hard to understand about Syndicate. Because on the surface, it does seem like a good game, and yet it, much more than Unity, marks a sharp decline in the series, at least in terms of sales. It was the second lowest selling game in the mainline series, behind Rook, obviously. Franchise fatigue is a concept that I don't put a lot of stock in. People were talking about franchise fatigue when this game came out, and yet here we are a decade later still making Assassin's Creed games that still sell pretty well. Fatigue only sets in if the stuff the franchise is putting out gets stale or bad, and since Syndicate isn't bad, it must be stale, right? On the surface, that doesn't seem true. Syndicate does plenty to keep things fresh. It adds new vehicle mechanics, it adds 2 new player protagonists in a new setting. If these things aren't enough, then what does creative stagnation really refer to? Why did Syndicate end this era of Assassin's Creed before it ever really began? Well, the only way to figure that out is to talk about it, so without further ado, let's talk about Assassin's Creed Syndicate and have some fun.
The iron ship's from here. The Templar running things is Rupert Ferris and our target 1. Target 2 is Sir David Brewster, who's got his hands on a bauble that could ruin us in this wretched war. Think you both can handle it?
What a question.
All right. My mistake. Ladies and gentlemen, the unstoppable Frye twins. See them nightly at Covent Garden.
Assassin's Creed Syndicate is the story of twin assassins Jacob and Evie Frye and their quest to free London from Templar control in the year 1868. It's also, once again, the story of you, the player, sitting on your couch doing some hacking for the assassins. One of the only story elements Syndicate actually carries over from Unity. This time you're looking for a different piece of Eden, the Shroud, which apparently Jacob and Evie came into contact with at some point during their adventure, and that Sean and Rebecca are out there looking for as you play. Overall, the modern day has slightly more going on than Unity, which is easy because it has more than nothing going on, but it's all still delivered to you in quick cutscenes with no player interaction. But at least Sean and Rebecca are back together, I guess. One of the most immediately obvious things you notice when playing Syndicate, especially if you've been playing every game in the series in a row for the last 5 months, is the massive tonal shift. Unity, for all of Arno's annoying quips, was a very serious game. Syndicate, on the other hand, is a much sillier game in most respects. It has jokes, not just made by the characters, but in the way that silly stuff will just happen in the story. It is easily the most openly comedic game in the series.
Maybe next time I'll walk.
Syndicate also has absolutely zero interest in the moral ambiguity the series had been trying to flirt with for the last few entries. The assassins are fully just the good guys, and the Templars are fully just the bad guys. In fact, the Templar Grandmaster, Crawford Starrick, has to be the most generic evil bad man in the whole series. I mean, look at this guy. This guy ties damsels to train tracks for fun. While this does make the story much simpler than Unity, I'll take simple good and evil over muddled attempts to justify horseshoe theory any day of the week. Syndicate has a light and breezy tone that's easy to get on board with. This is mostly on account of our two protagonists, the Frye twins, who the game wastes no time introducing. Syndicate starts with the twins already full-on assassins, having been raised into the order by their father. They're both young, they're the same age, they're twins, but they're in their early 20s. Actually, they're younger than me. That's a horrifying thought. Each of them gets an introductory mission introducing the basics of each character. Jacob is the silly one, Evie is the serious one. And that core dynamic is what drives the identity and journey of the entire game. For her target, Evie has studied the blueprints, she burns the evidence, detaches the train car to distract the guards. Everything is planned, and at least if you're playing accurately to her character, she pulls it off without anyone knowing she was there. Jacob has no plan. He jumps in a window, beats the crap out of the guards, and jumps the guy at the first opportunity. That core difference in approach defines Syndicate's mechanical and narrative structure. At least in theory. Both twins share ambition, though. The Templars control London and have done so for over 100 years. And as the opening narration explains, controlling London pretty much means controlling the entire British Empire. The assassins are too beaten down and scared to try and make any big moves on London, but the twins go rogue and head for London on their own to try and make a difference.
Patience, Evie.
The gentle sound of opportunity passing us by.
So what's stopping us? London is waiting to be liberated. Forget Crawley.
Father would have wanted us to listen.
Oh, Father. You could continue his legacy in London.
Freeing future generations from a city ruled by Templars. You know, Jacob Frye, you might just be right.
Then shall we?
Yes. Let's. Onward to London.
This is the drive that makes up the rest of the game, liberating London, block by block, borough by borough. The Templars control everything, the government, the police, and most importantly a street gang called the Blighters who control all crime in the city. To combat this, Jacob proposes creating a gang of their own, the Rooks, and with them, the war for London begins in earnest. Structurally, this actually evokes something like Saints Row more than it does previous Assassin's Creed games, and that is very much intentional. Along with everything it takes from previous games, Syndicate is kind of an attempt at a period piece crime sim. Instead of grand thefting autos, you're grand thefting horse-drawn carriages. Syndicate being set in the middle to late stage of the Industrial Revolution means a lot of very significant changes to the way the game has to be designed. Cities in this era are no longer built at pedestrian scales, they're built with roads and carriages. Buildings in the city centre now average 6 to 8 stories high, and this means the way you've historically gotten around cities in previous games just no longer works. Unfortunately, this shift in design changes the atmosphere of the city compared to previous games in a negative way, especially coming hot off the heels of Unity, the best open world in the series. Syndicate's London just doesn't really stand out to me. In crime sim fashion, the city is more a space to pass through rather than a space that you really linger in. It's beautiful, but there's no details that really stick in my mind, other than the obvious ones like Big Ben. Then again, as a true Scotsman, I am biased against all things English. It's not just that London is bigger than any previous city in the series, although it is. It's that it's not designed in the same way as previous cities. Running along the rooftops is just no longer a viable way to get around, so the game introduced 2 new ways to get around. One is expected, one is controversial. The expected one is the horse carriages, which operate pretty much like cars in any other open world crime sim. You can run up to one, yank out the driver and take it wherever you need to go. You even get a line on the road showing you the best route. The controversial method is the rope launcher, which allows you to quickly grapple to the top of rooftops and create zip lines between buildings to cross wide gaps. This is controversial because it's just a completely ridiculous and implausible device, even by modern technological standards, let alone the 1800s. We're jumping the crossbow big time here. It doesn't even make sense with how you use it in the game. Like, how the hell is it creating zip lines? But the thing is, the rope launcher clearly came out of a mechanical necessity. The buildings of this era are just too tall to satisfyingly climb around on. You can still climb manually, if you want, and it is painfully slow to get to the top. The rope launcher keeps the pace of the older games despite the much taller buildings. This is also where we get the game's other really big influence besides open world crime sims, which is Batman Arkham City. The comparisons are already obvious. The rope launcher works identically to the way Batman's works in the Arkham games. But if that wasn't enough, Syndicate also nixed Arkham's free flow combat system, albeit a little rougher around the edges. Syndicate ditches Unity's clunky and slow system in favour of a beat-em-up style brawler where keeping up your combo is essential to victory, exactly like Batman. It fits better than you might think, better than some of the many other games that stole Arkham's combat system at any rate, because the game is largely about street fights. By 1868, you couldn't just walk around with a sword at your hip anymore, so weapons had to be easily concealable, brass knuckles and cane swords. This also justifies the game not being a shooter, even if guns have at this point completely taken over how wars are fought. Guns are contraband, and they're also really loud, and the newly formed police force are going to come knocking if you solve everything with guns. If you're going to steal your mechanics from anywhere, you can steal them from much worse places than the Arkham games, but it does kind of alter how you play the game. You are Victorian Batman in the mechanics, even the game's upgrade system is heavily lifted from Arkham City. Batman leading a central gang war in Victorian London. That's Assassin's Creed Syndicate. My framing makes this all sound like a bad thing, and if you're an Assassin's Creed purist, then maybe it is, but after all the places the series has gone already, I don't really know what a pure Assassin's Creed experience looks like anymore. And all of Syndicate's mechanics come together to make a game that's pretty fun and enjoyable to play. The rope launcher might break realism, but it still feels like it fits the era to me. The Victorian era is known for all sorts of wacky inventions and innovations. So, sure, Alexander Graham Bell can whip up a Batman grappling hook for you, why not? As long as you don't think too hard about it and just enjoy how useful and fun it is to use, then everything is fine. The block-by-block city takeover has been with the series since Brotherhood, and Syndicate is the concept at its best iteration. Every block is tied to a specific activity. It could be a stronghold or an assassination target or a bounty that you can bring in alive for extra cash. Or maybe it's an exploitative factory where children are pressed into service, all ending in a full-on gang war to take over the borough for good. Some of these activities can get a little repetitive, but the important part is that they're all fast and open. You can do them however you want to handle them, the Jacob approach or the Evie approach. Either is perfectly valid. Either is a Batman approach. A lot of people take umbrage with Jacob for being the first protagonist in the series who is explicitly not built for stealth. Even though he can do it, he's just not as good at it as Evie. But I've never had a problem with this because Jacob, to me, is Ubisoft finally reckoning with the fact that exclusive focus on stealth is a distraction from what has always been the main selling point of the series, historical tourism. Not everyone who's interested in history has the patience for stealth, and Jacob is here as a lifeboat for those kinds of players. Even as someone who does like stealth, I think taking a break from it to run in and beat everyone up has its place. There's more than one way to not trigger an alarm, after all. The truth is that there are plenty of people who play the entire series like Jacob, and outside of something like Freedom Cry's Slave Revolt system, the games have never really punished that behaviour. Syndicate is just the first one that actively encourages it. And this idea that stealth is an option rather than a requirement is really Syndicate's biggest contribution to the ongoing series, because it's a philosophy that will be maintained going forward. To some, this strips the series of part of its identity, but this is something I talked about all the way back in Assassin's Creed 1. The series has always been more stealth-themed rather than an actual stealth game. It isn't until Unity that I'd say the series actually came up with stealth mechanics of any depth. And for what it's worth, I think Syndicate has some of the best stealth gameplay in the series. Without the buffers of Unity's annoying co-op integration, the system is streamlined to be much easier to pull off, and with the rope launcher it's easy enough to pull a Batman and zip away if you get caught. Unity had unique assassination opportunities for some of its targets, but a lot of the time they were very obtuse and finicky to pull off. Syndicate makes it a lot more obvious what you're supposed to do to make those unique kills happen. Jacob and Evie are not actually that mechanically different. It's small tweaks in numbers for the most part. Jacob takes less damage, Evie makes less noise, that sort of thing. Choosing to play one way or another is an active roleplay. There's nothing stopping you from running in guns blazing as Evie other than narrative inconsistency. But having two characters with each approach as a focus means that each angle is more fleshed out than it has been in previous games, and that is a distinct advantage of the two protagonist approach that I hope Assassin's Creed Shadows can build upon, although at time of making this the game isn't out yet, so I have no idea. While the story missions have you playing as one or the other, in the open world you can switch between the twins at any time, and the game feels best when you are switching every so often. A dip from one approach into the other keeps the game feeling fresh and stops it from getting too repetitive. Single-player games with multiple protagonists don't come around that often, but I think if done well it can be a very interesting feature both mechanically and narratively. How well does Syndicate actually pull the trick off? Well, that's where things get more complicated. Jacob and Evie have mostly separate journeys through the game, only crossing over every so often. This is because each character's story is determined by their personality and approach. Jacob is a hothead who acts before he thinks, and his objectives in London are twofold. First, he genuinely wants to liberate the city from its oppressors. He's nice like that. But secondly, he's dealing with some daddy issues. Jacob was not the favoured child, he was a troublemaker, and a lot of his actions in the game are the actions of a guy with something to prove. Does this make Jacob substantially different from the last 3 quippy white guy protagonists we've had in a row? Not overly, but I do like Jacob, he's fun. Where Arno's quips felt obnoxious because the game wanted me to think Arno was a badass, Jacob is more deliberately goofy, and that makes him a lot more endearing.
We need to return this city to the people who built it in the first place.
We will free London from Starrick. You have my word.
And my Rook's.
He's also the only protagonist in the series brave enough to wear a top hat and, even more shockingly, actually pull off the look, and you just have to respect that. Jacob's story takes on a structure that's actually most similar to Assassin's Creed 1. Starrick has various schemes underway in all aspects of society, so first you need to do an investigation into who's producing the dodgy snake oil or who's monopolising the London buses, and then, once you have a target, you have to get in and take them out. This systematic approach meshes wonderfully with the block-by-block dismantling that you're already doing in the open world, creating a nice consistency. But this also gives each chapter of Jacob's story a distinct tone and flavour, as each chapter is flavoured by the target. Sequence 5 with the bus businesses is all corporate espionage, while Sequence 7 is when Jacob gets into politics, hanging out with the out-of-touch rich folk of Westminster. Comedy ensues throughout. Jacob is a pretty simple guy, but his simplicity lets him slide easily into almost any situation. He is always having fun, so you're always having fun too, and as mentioned, the people you're taking down are comically evil, so there's no real concern about the morality of what you're doing.
I say we stop this goodwill towards strangers nonsense and focus on what London really needs. Solid leadership, whose hard work will raise everyone up to success. As go the titans of business, so goes the world.
Oi!
You weak fool. Get a job!
Iconic levels of evil, honestly. Each chapter is also intercut with a sequence of Starrick in his office getting more and more angry as his inner circle is killed off. These sequences don't really make any sense within the framing of the animus, but just don't worry about that, okay? They're here to reinforce that Starrick is a bad guy. He shoots his own men for interrupting his somber piano playing. He's a villain. I know this sounds silly, and it is silly. I genuinely find it quite funny how on-the-nose evil the Templars are in this game, but unlike Unity, it's not trying to make some weird point about extremism, it's just giving you ample reason to murder these bad guys, and that's fine. It's not the deepest the series has ever been, most certainly not, but it contributes to the atmosphere of the whole game. Jacob is able to have fun with this because these are irredeemable comic book villains, and the world is obviously a better place without them. In that way, Syndicate feels as tonally linked to Brotherhood as it does mechanically, and that's probably not just a coincidence because they share the same lead writer. Starrick is a villain in the same lineage as Cesare Borgia, just a bad guy who needs to be stopped. But where Brotherhood kept a philosophical route by having Machiavelli as one of your bros, this game doesn't have any significant philosophers who could fill that role at all. Pay no attention to the things happening on your screen right now, don't worry about it, keep having fun. Jacob's standout chapter is all about having fun. After taking enough districts, the leader of the Templar gangs, Maxwell Roth, invites Jacob over for dinner, beginning a whirlwind romance of chaos. Roth isn't a Templar himself, just an associate, and he's kinda sick of Starrick telling him what to do all the time, so he decides to have some fun alongside Jacob and get one over on Starrick. But the thing about fun is that fun has to come in moderation, and eventually Roth takes it too far. He decides it would really get to Starrick if they blew up some children, which for some reason Jacob just can't get behind. This is all obviously very heightened along with the tone, but the point of Roth is clear. He is a dark reflection of Jacob. You can treat everything like it's fun in games up to a point, but at the end of the day, he is still murdering people and his actions do still have long-reaching consequences.
Why did you do it? All of it.
What? Snap a baby crow's neck between my thumb and forefinger. Slice to bits the ones you deem innocent. Keep the world in its divine, manic state. For the same reason, I'd do anything. Why not?
Oh yeah, there is that too. I did say it was a romance. Actually, no, we should talk more about this because it is, to my memory, the first same-sex kiss in the series, and that feels like it's worth more than a mention. See, there's a bit of a disconnect between how I interpreted this relationship and moment and how the writer interpreted it. According to Jeffrey Yohelem, the lead writer, Jacob is bisexual, and moreover, Roth was actually in love with Jacob. If you go into the sequence with that foreknowledge, then you can kind of see it, but things do not progress like a typical romance. It's all completely subtextual. And personally, my interpretation was more of a replacement father sort of figure, especially given the obvious 20 to 30 year age difference between Jacob and Roth. Roth is someone who supports Jacob's wild side in a way that his own father never did. And the kiss itself is very much not framed in a romantic way, it's framed as just another aspect of Roth's Joker levels of chaos. Kissing Batman as he dies is absolutely something the Joker would do, and I suppose through the Batman lens that does kind of work. After all, there are plenty of interpretations of the Joker where he is in some sort of love with Batman, but that doesn't mean I would call the Joker good gay representation. In fact, maybe having your one gay guy be a sociopath who laughs as he murders children is bad representation, actually. Just a thought. None of this is to say that I don't believe Jeffrey when he says that Jacob is bisexual. I'm not an expert in these things, granted, but if any character in the series has chaotic bi energy, it's Jacob. In that way, it is representation, but in the gay Dumbledore way, where it's representation without actually having to commit to anything that may make your conservative audience feel slightly uncomfortable. The game also features a transgender character, Ned Wingert, the guy who gives you money for train heists and the like, but he is A, a very minor character, and B, his transness never actually comes up at all. Nobody ever comments on it. It's only made explicit in the honestly kind of terribly insensitively worded database entry about him. Also, he's played by a cis woman. It's early days for this kind of representation in video games ultimately, and as much shit as Ubisoft fairly gets, I think their commitment to representation in their games is stronger than people give them credit for. The intention is not malicious, at least not on the end of the writers. For the producers and business people, it almost certainly is. I guess I'm just disappointed that the series can give such nuanced and in-depth portrayals to Native Americans or African slaves, but when it comes to gay or trans people, it's more of a friendly shrug. Of course, that doesn't take into account that Syndicate is a very different game to previous entries, because Syndicate is fun. You might be wondering where Evie is in all of this. If Jacob is off doing all the assassinations, then what is Evie doing on her side of the story? Well, Evie's missions are split into two distinct categories: a treasure hunt for the Piece of Eden and cleaning up Jacob's mess. Where Jacob is all short-term thinking, run in and kill everyone, Evie is a long-term thinker and is better able to see the direct consequences of Jacob's actions. Starrick's Templars work in positions of power at every level of London's infrastructure. Yes, they're blatantly evil, but that doesn't mean they're not important. Take, for example, Pearl Attaway, who runs the London buses. After being tricked into killing her biggest rival and then killing Pearl herself, Jacob has just destabilised the entire London bus industry. There's a power vacuum that can either be filled by someone even worse than Pearl Attaway, or, with Evie's help, by a coalition of the people. This is a story idea that Assassin's Creed has never really tackled before, and that I honestly think is great, focusing on what happens after you kill the big bad guy. Because killing the bad guy isn't just an automatic fix-all solution, you also need to replace the bad guy with something better. Jacob's most iconic screw-up is actually killing Mr. Get-a-Job from earlier, because that guy was the manager of the Bank of London, and Jacob kills him in the middle of robbing his own bank. Finding the guy dead whilst robbing his own bank ruins public opinion of the bank's ability to secure their money. And on top of that, in the chaos, someone steals the plates for printing money, creating perfect forgeries with them. Jacob has just destabilised the entire British economy and sent the value of the pound into the low decimals. Apparently, the original plan was for this to have actual gameplay consequences, making everything in the shops automatically expensive, or for the buses thing to disable fast travel. And I would have loved that, but they chickened out because they're cowards. Instead, the consequences are just told to you, not actually felt in the game world. Still, the point is clear, and the point isn't that Jacob is wrong, the point is that he's too reckless, which is countered by Evie, who on the other hand is too cautious. Evie would have taken months longer, if not years, to actually go after the Templars in London, and in that time they would have continued to exploit the people of the city. Evie's mission to prevent the Shroud from falling into Templar hands is about preventing potential future harm, but it does nothing to address what they're actually doing in the present. Jacob and Evie balance each other, that's what makes them effective dual protagonists. Her caution is also what factors into her personal story arc. Unlike Jacob, Evie was the favoured child, to the point of having a kind of unhealthy reverence to her father's teachings, the most critical of which is, do not let your emotions compromise the mission. The third most important character in the game is Henry Green, who runs the Assassin Bureau in London. He's not an assassin of action as much as he's a planning and logistics sort of guy. He's also Evie's love interest, and unlike Unity, someone on the writing team actually understood how to write a romance, which is nice. But I suppose before getting into that, I should address the obvious in the room, which is that Evie is a woman, only the second female protagonist in the series. Evie's identity is not as critical to the game as Aveline's was to Liberation, but it can't be unimportant either. It doesn't come up much or really at all within the game because we're having fun, but it's important in the real world, especially with how the game plays with gender dynamics. Evie's relationship with Henry is kind of a flip of the standard love story in this sort of game. In fact, it's pretty much exactly an inverse of the romance in Assassin's Creed Revelations. Evie is the action-oriented badass who doesn't want to commit to a relationship, and Henry is the delicate bookworm who needs to be rescued. Something that comes across in Evie's story that's really uncommon in most video games is that it's specifically written by women to appeal to women. It's a bit of that what men think women want versus what they actually want situation. Melissa McCoubrey, another writer on the game who wrote a lot of the Evie stuff, mentioned in an interview that early drafts of Henry had him as this stoic soldier badass type, someone who would be appealing to a masculine ideal. But what most women actually want is a handsome gentleman who respects you, never pressures you, supports you in all of your endeavours without trying to steal the spotlight, and also has a mysterious past that gives him a little bit of intrigue without being too threatening. Also, he may be a bastard prince. This isn't me making fun of Henry at all. I like Henry a lot. He's cute. It's just always interesting to see an ideal man as written from a woman's perspective. One of the collectibles in the game is entirely dedicated to Henry and Evie's relationship as they both get into collecting pressed flowers. Initially kind of ironically, but they bond over their shared enjoyment of this weird thing rich people do.
Mignonette, your qualities surpass your charms.
Not entirely sure that's meant as a compliment. Love in a Mist. That's a pretty name.
Alternatively called Devil in a Bush.
Narcissus. Self-love. I should buy a bouquet for Jacob.
Most unkind, Miss Frye.
As amusing as all this is, I really should be getting back to work. If you need me...
I'll send a bouquet.
Of irises?
A message. Indeed.
Evie kind of pushes Henry out into the field with her because she likes having him around, but she's not willing to admit to herself that that's the reason. Her caution and her reverence to her father's words prevent her from being open about her feelings, and when Henry is captured and she abandons the mission to rescue him, she realises that she's been compromised and tries to distance herself. It's actually good romantic tension, probably the best the series has done because the conflict is entirely internal. It's definitely much better than Unity because Evie's love interest isn't her brother, which must have been very difficult for them, but I'm glad they managed to resist. The only thing preventing Evie from starting a relationship with Henry is herself. A late-game revelation from the deposed Maharaja of the Sikh Empire, but let's not worry about him right now, we're having fun, is that Evie's mother was also an assassin, which calls into question the validity of her father's insistence on avoiding attachments. Perhaps just because her dad insisted upon it doesn't mean it was correct, because her dad, just like anyone, was a person driven by emotions. This is all good stuff. The issue is how tangential it is. And this gets into the bigger problem with the setup of the whole game, that while mechanically Jacob and Evie are balanced, narratively they are not. On average, Jacob gets 4 missions per sequence and Evie gets 2, and she doesn't actually appear in sequence 8 at all. Her missions don't really advance the plot as much as Jacob's do either. She gets 2 assassination targets to Jacob's 6. This was, of course, a mandate from the higher-ups at Ubisoft. One of the more minor reveals of the 2020 reports was that Syndicate originally had a 50-50 split between its 2 leads, as you would expect a game with 2 leads to do. But the marketing director, a real weirdo by the name of Sergei Haskowit, had them trim Evie's role and focus most of the marketing on Jacob because, as is the old adage, women don't sell. That's why on the box art we get Jacob front and centre and then Evie off to the side with as much prominence as a random gang member. This is annoying for obvious reasons, but the one I want to talk about is that it creates a weirdly uneven experience. In terms of gameplay, Jacob and Evie are equals. They get an equal share of the rewards to be found around the city, an equal skill tree, and if you're switching between them every so often, as the game kind of encourages you to, an equal share of the open world activities. The fact that the narrative is uneven just feels wrong. It gives the false impression that Evie was tacked on to quell the outrage Unity caused because of its lack of playable female characters, when in reality Syndicate was in production before Unity came out and the dual protagonist system was integral from the game's conception. There's an argument to be made that Syndicate would be a more meaningful active representation if Evie was the only protagonist, and even if I personally find her more interesting than Jacob, that's not really what I want to argue, because the game is so clearly designed to be a game of 2 perspectives, and I still like Jacob. The Frye twins have a great and compelling dynamics. I don't want to throw out the big hairy baby with the bathwater here. Evie was only minimised because she's a woman. If it was a game of two brothers, this would not be the case, and there's just no other explanation for that than misogyny. It sucks. It significantly dampens what is otherwise an extremely solid piece of female representation in video games and the structure of the game's story. An imbalance between the twins is actively contradictory to what the game is trying to do, and a cynical part of me wonders if they thought they could justify this with maths. Syndicate's most surprising and most delightful feature is the Rift. At the top of the Thames, there's a hole in the simulation. The story never points you there, but if you enter the hole, you'll be transported to an entirely different time and protagonist. Lydia Frye, Jacob's granddaughter during the First World War. The UI unfortunately spoils this because it says World War I when you hover over it on the map, but the surprise is still there because of how in-depth this little bonus thing actually is. This is so much more than the quick little flashes in Unity. It's a chunk of an entirely different story, complete with its own space to explore centred around Tower Bridge that operates like a secret final district of the open world. You work alongside a pre-Bulldog era Winston Churchill to root out German spies, as well as the Templars working with them. It is maybe the best part of the entire game, mostly I think because of how much work they put into something completely unexpected. The atmosphere of London at war is perfect, from the sounds of planes whizzing overhead, the sunset palette lighting up the military checkpoints and tanks, and the spotlight shooting up into the sky on the hunt for raiding zeppelins. This section has entirely separate music, new enemies, and of course Lydia herself, who might have my favourite design out of any assassin in the whole series. It's also got mechanics that are exclusive to this one section, like generators which you can turn off and on to cause distractions, or air defense against incoming biplanes and zeppelins, which is kind of completely mixing up their world wars, but I don't care because it's fun. The whole thing is only about an hour long, but it's so good you can actually forget for a while that you're playing a game set in Victorian London. The commitment to capturing the vibes of World War I are just so perfect. It feels like DLC, and I don't mean that as an insult, it feels like exceptionally good DLC that I would pay money for. Which makes its inclusion in the base game completely insane to me. AAA games aren't supposed to give you the good stuff without charging extra. It might make up a tiny chunk of London, but it's a clever chunk. Tower Bridge is one of the most iconic landmarks in London, but it didn't exist in 1868, it was built in 1894. With this little trickery, they get to include it in the game alongside all of London's other important landmarks. And it happens to be literally right next to the Tower of London for good measure. The Rift is sort of a replacement for having any playable sequences in the modern day, and frankly, I'll take this over walking around a warehouse any day of the week. It's a message from Juno, who's reaching out to you, the player on the couch, to try and recruit you into her cult. Lydia, during this time, came into contact with a sage who was trying to bring Juno back to life, which is again what her cult are trying to do in the modern day. As you go through the sequence, Juno pops up to try and explain to you why that's a good thing, actually. That part I can take or leave, but working to root out spies with Churchill is great fun, and even though she only has like 10 lines, Lydia leaves such a strong impression that I desperately want a full game with her. She's got that 1920s fast-talking wit, and also she's a suffragette.
Short on soldiers, are we?
If you could put your considerable talents to good use at Tower Bridge, you would have the thanks of a brave but beleaguered nation.
I would settle for the right to vote.
Yeah, fucking get him, girl. Although, that brings up something we've kind of been deliberately avoiding so far, doesn't it? That for all of my talk of Jacob and Evie being equals, in the eyes of the law at the time, they weren't, were they? And not even by Lydia's time, 50 years later, were men and women considered equals. Hell, a lot of people don't consider men and women equal today, especially in the 2015 game industry. Lydia bringing this up is absolutely in keeping with Assassin philosophy on freedom and equality, so why is World War I the first time we're hearing about it? Well, I suppose it's only fun when you know something is going to be done about it.
If you concede to this, I give you my word that once I've battled my way back into Parliament, I shall see if something can't be done about your request. As you are aware, a vote can be far more lethal than a bullet or a blade.
Not that it's entirely fair to give Churchill the credit for that, but he was at least pro-giving women the vote by 1916, I think. Honestly, researching Winston Churchill is a black hole. I mean, do I take my information from the Churchill Project, the Churchill Archive, the International Churchill Society, or maybe even a source that doesn't have his name in it? Uh-oh, I don't think we're having fun anymore, are we? A spectre is haunting Assassin's Creed Syndicate, the spectre of communism. Well, actually, there's plenty of spectres haunting Syndicate, but let's go with that one, because yes, Karl Marx is in this game as one of your friends. Syndicate's entire approach to history is kind of a radical departure from anything else in the series because absolutely nothing in the story ties into real historical events. A couple of the Templar targets are real historical figures, like Lord Cardigan, but the majority of them are fictional, including Starrick himself. And I think this comes down to the game's setting, the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution is not so much a revolution in the same way as the American or French revolutions. It's not so much a specific event as it is an entire 100-year period of history. Setting your game in the Industrial Revolution is actually pretty vague. A heck of a lot of stuff happened in that time. Assassin's Creed 2 did the same thing. The Renaissance is similarly a historical period rather than an event, but Assassin's Creed 2 and by extension Brotherhood still chose a specific focus, the rise and fall of the Borgia family. Syndicate is, more than any other game in the series up to this point, a true historical playground. It treats its setting with no particular academic interest, but purely as a place of fun visuals and gadgets and characters that it can smoosh together in entertaining ways. It is a total regression to a point of historical sanitation beyond even Assassin's Creed 2. The same thing which Liberation was calling into question as inherently sinister is in Syndicate presented in a completely uncritical way. Syndicate's Victorian London is a pop culture idealised version of a time and place with no resemblance to reality. There is no racism, no sexism, no homophobia, no transphobia. The Rooks and the Blighters are both completely egalitarian in their recruitment and even who they'll allow to be in charge. Women run the most important companies in the country. Lydia Frye asking for the right to vote in 1916 kind of puts up front exactly the weirdness of this portrayal. This was not a time when any of this would have been socially normalised. There's not an issue in Evie being an assassin because the Assassins have always been an open and accepting organisation, but that should be transgressive outside of the Assassins. The fact that it causes no issues anywhere from anyone, not even the villains, is pretty blatant whitewashing of history. Syndicate's 1868 London is honestly more accepting of women than our real-life modern-day London is. This is a consequence of the game's playground approach to history. Syndicate only cares about player fun, and in no way whatsoever wants to challenge the player. This is a step beyond Unity's commitment to centrism, because at least that was a commitment to something. Syndicate actively does not want to commit to anything, and that's most clear in its treatment of historical figures. Syndicate's historical figures are treated as guest celebrities. They come in, have some fun adventures with the Frye twins, and then they head off again without any in-depth discussion of what these people actually stood for or what makes them so important to history. Here's Charles Darwin. Help him collect some fossils and tear down some mean posters about him. Okay, bye, Mr. Darwin. Here's Benjamin Disraeli. To help him foil an assassination attempt, help his airheaded wife do some poverty tourism, and especially help him mess with his old rival Gladstone. Okay, bye, Mr. Disraeli. Here's Karl Marx. Help him put together some labour groups and prevent some explosive mishaps. Okay, bye, Mr. Marx. Here's Queen Victoria herself. Help her foil some Templar terrorist plots and get knighted. Okay, bye, Your Majesty. The idea that you can jump from a side quest where you're directly working for the Queen to a side quest where you're protecting Marx from the secret police is completely bonkers. You can say many things about Karl Marx, but he was a man of pretty strong convictions and he absolutely would not have tolerated this kind of flippant party line crossing. Obviously, you can't put Karl Marx in your game without it being some kind of political statement. Syndicate has vaguely progressive sympathies overall, which is a pretty sharp contrast to Unity's centrism with a tinge of Tory. But this is a very family-friendly version of Marx. Kindly Uncle Marx, the goofy but well-intentioned German activist.
Killing people and destroying property solves nothing. Democracy is the only road to socialism.
Let's ignore that he's saying this to a person who kills people and destroys property to solve things. That's the obvious contradiction. This is a pretty hefty softening of Marx's actual beliefs. I wouldn't say he was fully pro-violence, but he was at best ambivalent on it, viewing it in a lot of cases as inevitable. I mean, let's read the very last paragraph of the Communist Manifesto, shall we? The communists disdain to conceal their views and aims. They openly declare that their ends can only be attained by the forcible overthrow of all existing societal conditions. Let the ruling classes tremble at the communistic revolution. The proletarians have nothing to lose but their chance. They have a world to win. Those certainly aren't the words of a man who believes democracy is the only path to socialism, and this was written 20 years before Syndicate is set. But hey, even if they soften him around the edges, at least Marks makes sense as someone that the assassins would be chummy with. It makes a heck of a lot more sense than being chummy with the Queen of the British Empire, although to its credit the game does address this at the end of the questline in an honestly pretty funny bit of lampshading.
You have honoured us with your loyalty and courage. Long may we strengthen the Empire together.
Your Majesty, we will always work to ensure the safety of the people.
But with the greatest respect, our philosophy forbids us from assisting with the expansion of the Empire. Perhaps, ma'am, you could consider putting an end to your imperialist desires.
Hey Vicky, could you stop conquering the globe please? It's kinda killing the vibe. I think the icing on the cake of this scene though is how Victoria doesn't even acknowledge Evie's request. She just politely pretends that she didn't hear it. I think Evie's lucky she wasn't shot right there and then, because, yeah, for some reason I need to keep repeating this, the British Empire was not a force for good in the world. Historically, Victoria survived 8 separate assassination attempts, and it wouldn't be a stretch to imagine that some of those were from the assassins. But in Syndicate, we're going to reduce this total philosophical breakdown to some jokes about cake. As telling as all that is, what's just as telling is what the game doesn't include, like, for example, any mention of Ireland. 1868 just so happens to be the year of the last ever public execution in England. It was in London, just outside of Newgate Prison, and the culprit was an Irish Fenian who'd been involved in a bombing. Ireland wasn't doing so hot in the mid-1800s on account of a little thing you may have heard of called the Irish Potato Famine, in which, to put it bluntly, the British government let Ireland starve in order to maintain the economy. Which, as you can imagine, inspired quite a bit of revolutionary spirit in Ireland, which is what the Fenians were. And just so we're clear, at this time Ireland was entirely a part of the United Kingdom. This stuff was a pretty big deal at the time. At least one of Victoria's attempted assassins did so in an attempt to free Fenian political prisoners, but there is zero reference to any of this in Syndicate, not even in a minor database entry somewhere. In fact, I don't think there's a single Irish person in the whole game. It's not history that can be made fun, so Syndicate just pretends that it doesn't exist at all. Removing politics, context, and ideology from these historical figures and time periods might make them more palatable, but it also removes what makes them interesting, what makes them historic in the first place. Gladstone and Disraeli's bitter lifelong rivalry is so interesting because of how it reshaped the entirety of British politics, as the two of them spent over 40 years going back and forth trying to one-up the other. If you remove the context of their beliefs and the parties they stand for, then they're just two old men who hate each other. Marx is interesting because his ideas arguably reshaped the entire world. So what's the point of including Marx if you're not going to get into those ideas? Even the likes of Charles Dickens. Dickens was not just a novelist, his stories are so famous and long-lasting because he wrote about the problems he saw in his society and moreover tried to make sure his stories made a real difference. What is A Christmas Carol if not the most on-the-nose scaring the rich straight story ever? I mean, isn't that why they chose him as an ally of the assassins in the first place? And this gets back to a question I asked at the very start of the series. What is Assassin's Creed? The series has never claimed to be educational or a depiction of real history, so what is it then, and what should it be? In that same interview with Jeffrey Yohalam, where he talked about Jacob and Roth, he also talked about this, specifically about the game's overly progressive for the time portrayal of women, but about the game's idealised version of history in general. He explained that he had wanted to make the game's portrayal more true to history, but when they did an inter-office poll, every single woman on the team voted against it.
You know, that there's this choice, you know, she brought it up, the choice between seeing history through the lens of today or trying to get at what it really was like.
Yeah.
And we made the choice to make it through the lens of today because a lot of the women, or I guess all of the women on the team, said, we don't really like reading historical fiction because it treats women terribly. Why would I want to read about a time period where women were treated terribly?
I find this really hard to argue against, not because I agree with it, but because I'm not sure it's really my place to disagree with it. I'm not a woman. I don't know what it's like to try and enjoy a hobby like video games when so many of the games that come out have hostile depictions of women. Even if those depictions annoy me, they don't affect me in the same way. I talked earlier about how Evie is written in a way to be specifically appealing to female players, and this is ultimately a much bigger part of that. It's escapism, it's entertainment. If you come home from a workplace where your boss is a misogynist asshole, you probably don't want to come home and play a game where all the NPCs are misogynist assholes to you. If a woman wants to play around in Victorian London without being reminded of every asshole who's catcalled her on the street, then who the hell am I to deny her that? After all, have I not been arguing for a while now that the Assassin's Creed games are cozy games? But I do still want to push back on this choice, and my objections are rooted in the things the franchise has already done. Because Assassin's Creed 3 would not be so impactful, and it certainly wouldn't be one of my all-time favourites if it was written like Assassin's Creed Syndicate. This is a pivotal question in what Assassin's Creed should be. No, they are not educational games, they do not teach real history, but that does not mean they can't still educate anyway. I am sure some Native Americans were put off playing Assassin's Creed 3 because of its depictions of their people suffering and dying, and that is completely fair. But I'm also sure that a lot more people, including myself, know more about Native history and have a lot more sympathy for modern Native Americans exactly because Assassin's Creed 3 told that story. A story that they still don't teach in a lot of high schools. This is more broadly a question of the purpose of representation in the first place. Who is representation actually for? Is representation meant for the people it represents, or is it meant as a tool of education about the people it represents? The answer is both, or rather, there should be different stories that cater to both. There should be stories that help educate people about the history of exploitation, racism, sexism, and abuse, and there should be stories that just show people of all shapes and sizes and all positions of society without it being a big deal. Or you can pull a Star Trek and do both at once, but not everyone can be as cool as Star Trek. No matter how much 4chan likes to claim I do, I don't know what it's like to be a woman, which is exactly why I need stories that show me what it's like to be a woman, something which video games are uniquely suited to provide. That, selfishly to me, is a tremendous value that representation provides. Assassin's Creed is the most famous historical fiction game franchise on the market, and it has an opportunity to be a tremendous tool of representation and education because history is full of stories that should be told but so often aren't. Like Connors, or Adewales, or Evies, or another big one in this game that we haven't even gotten to yet. They have an audience full of wide-eyed white boys like me who should learn what it was like to be a slave in the Caribbean or a woman in Victorian London, and why it's so important to fight for a future where things are never like that again. And if that approach alienates some women from playing the game, then I don't take that as a failing of the game, I take that as a sign that we need more games for women. I actually do think Assassin's Creed can be cool like Star Trek if it wants to be. The safety net of the Assassins means that things never need to get too graphic, explicit, or exploitative. Because even in a hostile world, the Assassins always provide a place where people can feel comfortable. I am sympathetic to Syndicate's approach because Syndicate is fun and it is comfortable. It's a game that feels pleasant to play, but those are things I can get from tons and tons of games. I come to Assassin's Creed hoping to get more than that. At the end of Syndicate, the good guys kill the bad guy in a frankly terrible boss fight, but still, the twins resolve their differences, Evie kisses Henry, and they all get knighted by the Queen, and then they run off into the sunset as heroes. And that's nice, and nice is all that it is. It provokes no other emotion other than a feeling of a job well done. Or, I suppose, if I'm being fair, laughter one of the best jokes in the whole series.
The key to the waltz is one must lead with one's right foot.
Oh, my!
Everything all right, my dear?
Do you require assistance? I never liked balls.
Absolute perfection.
Your attempts to influence Parliament for the Indian cause have failed. You must do more.
I will not jeopardize my relationship with Queen and country to satisfy your crusade.
Your Highness, you belong to India, not here acting the part of a noble foreigner.
Like pretty much all the games in the series, Syndicate has its big impressive DLC pack with lots of time and money put into it, but it also has a weird little mission pack called the Last Maharaja. Actually, it has two weird little mission packs, but only one of them is available on Xbox, and when I learned what the other one is, I don't think I've ever felt more personally slighted by Ubisoft. One of the weirdest omissions from Syndicate is Unity's murder mystery side quests, which would have been such an obvious fit for Victorian London that not having them seems like a waste. That's what I've always thought until I learned while making this video that there's an entire chain of murder mystery side quests starring a little baby Arthur Conan Doyle that was exclusive to PlayStation, got a PC release but never made it onto Xbox. As someone who's listened to every single Sherlock Holmes story, I have never felt more robbed. So instead of talking about that for 2 hours, I guess we'll just have to make do with The Last Maharaja, which frankly is a poor consolation prize. The Last Maharaja sits somewhere between a full expansion and one of the side quest chains of the historical figures of the base game. It's about 3 times as long as any of those quest chains in the base game and includes missions that are generally more involved, but production-wise it's clearly not up to the level of a full campaign with a lot of in-engine cutscenes and just in general a missing level of polish. The Last Maharaja refers to Duleep Singh, who was, you guessed it, the last Maharaja of the Punjab. And considering Syndicate's approach to everything else, this is kind of an insane topic for them to try and tackle. What the British Empire did to India is one of the greatest travesties in history. Over the course of its colonisation, the British decimated Indian infrastructure, culture, and society at large in the name of enriching Britain and Britain alone. Singh's place in history is complicated. He spent almost none of his life actually in India because the Punjab was annexed by the Empire when he was 10 and he was later exiled to live in London, lest he or the Punjabi people get any ideas about reinstating their own leadership. He was essentially a prisoner, but it was a very fancy prison because Queen Victoria had taken a liking to him, having a fascination with India and Indian culture despite never visiting herself, and also ruling an empire that was actively ruining the country, but denial is a hell of a drug. He's kind of symbolic of the way the British Empire successfully convinced itself of its own bullshit. Look how lavishly this man is living. Isn't this proof of the Empire's nobility? Don't worry about the fact that we're actively preventing him from seeing his own country or even his own mother. Why would he want to? He's in London, the centre of the world. Singh is in the main game, although he doesn't get his own quest chain until the DLC. He's a friend, and I think technically uncle of Henry, who brings him in to get some plans for Buckingham Palace. Because it's impossible to introduce this guy at all without talking about real history, the game does vaguely address his situation with a quest where he's trying to convince members of Parliament to return the Punjab to him, which obviously doesn't go very well, but it does make your later interactions with Victoria so much weirder. The DLC is an entirely fictional romp where you work with Singh to foil a conspiracy by the Templars and the East India Company to discredit Singh and crush freedom forever in India. It's certainly a braver story than anything in the base game, and they do deserve a little credit for being willing to put a guy like Singh in the game at all. He was the only historical figure in the game I hadn't heard of before playing the game because Indian history is really something that Britain does not like talking about. The DLC portrays the East India Company as flatly and cartoonishly evil as the Templars, which is fair enough. Frankly, they aren't that. However, it is a sign that the DLC is still aiming for fun much more than it's aiming for anything meaningful. It's mostly an excuse to string together a bunch of creative ideas for missions like defending a boat down the Thames or doing a heist in the Tower of London, or Jacob getting really drunk and having to retrace his steps to figure out exactly what happened to his shirt. The problem with that is that Duleep Singh just isn't a very fun character. The game can't quite decide if he's a rich kid in over his head or a secret badass, and you kinda need to pick one if you want a solid character. And you should pick the first one because it's truer to life. By all accounts, Singh was a pretty lavish spender in his youth and only really started trying to reclaim his homeland in his later life after when the game is set. Also, he's a deposed monarch, but he is still a monarch, so even if the assassins would obviously support a free India, I don't necessarily think they'd want to secure it by reinstating a Maharaja. But we've already beaten the assassins and the monarchy thing to death at this point, haven't we? The Last Maharaja is a step in the right direction. It is at least acknowledging a history that more people should be aware of, but it still refuses to drop its commitment to fun as the only possible emotion, and that prevents it from saying anything truly worthwhile.
For 20 years, after the assassins defeated the Templars in London, the city enjoyed a certain peace. Until the Autumn of Terror.
In what's becoming a bit of a pattern, Syndicate's last and biggest DLC is in many ways an attempt to appease me and address a lot of my complaints about the base game. It has a much darker tone, a much more serious approach to history, and as a result, a much more meaningful form of representation as well. On the surface, it's the most obvious thing to do in the world. It's Jack the Ripper. Of course, any story set in Victorian London has to do Jack the Ripper, and they all need to have their own spin on it as well. It's the kind of story that actively demands creative interpretation, one of the most gruesome murder sprees with almost no evidence and no resolution. The real-life Jack the Ripper was never found, and has still never been found to this day. It's practically begging for a place in Assassin's Creed's increasingly convoluted secret history, and the way Syndicate goes about this is interesting. But doing Jack the Ripper does present some issues for Syndicate, the primary one being that the Autumn of Terror was a full 20 years after when the game is set. This could make the DLC being so far removed from the base game feel kind of jarring and disconnected, and it does a bit, but the most impressive thing about this DLC is that by the end of it, the base game kind of feels like one big prologue to this DLC. Here's the setup. Sometime after the main game, Evie moved to India with Henry to help rebuild the Indian Brotherhood. After receiving a letter from her brother about a string of murders, she got on the first ship home, but by the time she gets there, Jacob is missing and presumed dead. So it's up to Evie to find the killer and save her brother. Because it's set 20 years later, it gets the strange honour of being one of only 4 times I have ever played a woman over 40 in a single-player game, because Jack the Ripper is Evie's story. The other times, in case you were wondering, are Jedi Survivor from last year, when, spoilers, you play as Seer for a chapter, Queen Maeve in Thronebreaker, the obscure spin-off of Gwent, the spin-off of the Witcher games, and the last one is Iden Versio from Battlefront 2, and that also happens to be a timeskip DLC from a campaign where she was young and marketable. The fact that 9 years later this is still noteworthy is a sharp bit of commentary on the state of the industry. Really, for as much fuss is made about the overabundance of female protagonists today by a certain sect of the internet, the female protagonists we get still mostly all fit into the box of being young and beautiful. Meanwhile, you don't even have to leave this franchise to get grey hairs on the men. Ezio spends the majority of his time over 40. He's 50 by Revelations, which also has sequences with Altair up to his 90s. Adewale is in his 40s by the time of Freedom Cry, and we get to see him in his mid-60s in Rogue, and Shay is pushing 50 in the epilogue of Rogue as well. Other than Revelations, which is about retirement, these men being middle-aged is barely worth a mention because it's so commonplace in the industry. We're drowning in dads, and we have no mums. So I do want to actually give Syndicate its dues for doing this, even if it's only for a DLC, because they didn't have to. They could have focused on Jacob again, and they didn't just draw a few lines on her face and call it a day. She looks noticeably older. Her face has changed in the way that a woman's face does after 20 years of guerrilla warfare and likely a few kids. There's a lot of reasons that Evie makes more sense as the protagonist of this story, but the primary one is the Ripper's victims, all but one of whom were women over the age of 40. So having it be a woman over 40 who ultimately takes the Ripper down is a level of irony that most Jack the Ripper adaptations are far too cowardly to ever attempt. There is, of course, a question of sensationalism when it comes to any true crime story, but for one extremely glaring exception, which we'll get to, I think Syndicate handles the whole thing with a deft hand. It doesn't show any of the gory details of the murders, it leaves it all mostly implied, which I think is more effective anyway, and it has an extreme focus on showcasing the humanity and normalcy of prostitutes, who were, of course, the Ripper's targets. The DLC doesn't add any new parts to London, in fact it trims the whole map down to only 2 districts. However, this condensation also lets the DLC build up a much greater sense of tone and atmosphere with its 2 districts than the base game did. Whitechapel, the scene of the Ripper's spree, was the tutorial district in the base game, and once you're done with it, you never really have a reason to go back again. So by the time of the DLC, Whitechapel honestly feels kind of fresh again. It's a whole different vibe. The eternal summer of the base game is gone in favour of a moody, foggy winter, a much more oppressive and claustrophobic atmosphere. It fits the change in tone perfectly, and it's combined with a whole host of new activities to do in the open world, because while hunting Jack the Ripper is the main objective, Jack's influence is spread across the city. There are 3 allies this time around, and each represents a critical part of the Jack the Ripper phenomena. There's the police, naturally. Jack has inspired a vile street gang to follow him. A gang called the Rooks, because Jacob and Evie never quite learned the lesson that Julius learned back in Saints Row 1, that solving a street gang problem with a street gang doesn't actually solve the street gang problem. There's the media. Jack the Ripper's continued fame to this day is partly due to the media craze he caused when he supposedly sent confession letters to the press, which in turn inspired dozens of copycats, which Evie has to track down and put a stop to. And then finally, a lot of the open world activities are centred around protecting and saving prostitutes, as Jack's actions have inspired a rash of hostile actions towards sex workers across the city, and Evie has to help by clearing out brothels of thugs and exploitative owners, or saving women from abuse at the hands of their clients. There is a delicate line to walk here, and it's not one that historically the franchise has walked very carefully. One of the many things that got Anita Sarkeesian dragged through the mills back in the day was her criticism of the Assassin's Creed series' portrayal of sex workers as primarily a player tool and as eye candy, otherwise lacking any real humanity. I think that's a bit harsh, personally, but I don't think it's fully wrong either. I mean, who could forget the sexy nun back in Assassin's Creed 2? Syndicate's base game, on the other hand, omitted prostitutes entirely, which, considering they've been in almost every previous game, was a pretty glaring omission. Mechanically, prostitutes in this DLC do the same thing they've always done. They distract guards for you, but a huge amount of time and effort is spent drawing attention to the actual personhood of the prostitutes. They aren't just prostitutes, they have names. They're people who've lived often complicated lives and shouldn't be defined solely by their profession. The game doesn't even really sexualize them all that much. Your main contact for the prostitutes, Nellie, isn't that provocatively dressed, especially compared to the sexy nun. Nellie is a person. Being a prostitute is just her job. That might sound obvious, but video games did not have a very good history with their portrayal of sex work. You are rescuing these women from abuse, but the point is that you're rescuing these women. There's an understanding there that prostitutes are more than just sex objects, which is how they've been historically treated in a lot of video games. And obviously the person doing the saving changes the optics as well. It's explicitly a story of a woman defending other women. Of course, the game's most controversial reveal is that all of the Ripper's victims, except for the last one, were actually assassins, along with the Ripper himself. And this is where we get into the meat of the story, and the reason that I say this DLC makes the entire game feel like a prologue. There are two main things that contribute to this feeling. One is that the DLC is about rescuing Jacob, a motive that has a lot more stakes for the player if they've played the base game and have gotten to know Jacob, which if they have also makes his jolly, wet and easy breezy attitude's total absence all the more obvious, as if the world's colour has gone missing with him. The second is the absolutely perfect dynamic the DLC establishes between Evie and Sergeant Aberlane, the detective in charge of the Ripper case. Aberlane is a real historical figure who is most famous for being the detective in charge of the Ripper case, so his presence in the base game was kind of always an indication that the game would be doing Jack the Ripper eventually. In the base game, Aberlane is the Frye twins' inside man in the police. They help him out by bringing in those bounties. He helps them out in various different ways with information, or in the case of the last mission, smuggling weapons into Buckingham Palace for them. He's also a bit of a comic relief character, always showing up in weird and elaborate disguises for no apparent reason. But now in the DLC, that prior connection between them adds an extremely interesting dynamic to the entire Ripper investigation. Aberlane owes his career to the Frye twins, and when it becomes increasingly obvious that Jack the Ripper is an assassin himself, that puts him in a really awkward position.
Monster. You damn monster!
Oi! You're not allowed in here! Evie! Get a hold of yourself! Go! Out!
Who is she? Tell me quickly!
Tell you? By what right? I am an officer of the law. I am not a member of your secret organization.
Listen to me! Jacob knows...
No, you listen to me. I cannot cover for you much longer. All the evidence points to your brother, your order, you. You need to deliver the Ripper's head on a spike soon, or I'm afraid there'll be nothing to stop my men from arresting you in his stead.
You'll have his head, even if it costs me mine.
The change in tone from the light-hearted fun of the base game is really jarring, but also welcome. In fact, if anything, the serious tone of the DLC is enhanced by the fact that the base game was so light-hearted, because it just emphasises how grim and serious the situation is. All of the jokes have disappeared. These things come together to create a plausible explanation for why the Ripper was never caught and why we know so few details about him. On the one hand, he was an assassin trained to be a master of stealth, and on the other hand, the detective in charge was covering it up to try and protect his friends and the assassins at large from being exposed to the world. There was many theories before the DLC came out that Jacob himself was going to be Jack the Ripper, which would have been such a tremendously awful decision that I almost wish they had done it just to see how badly it would have went down. But the DLC doesn't focus on the Ripper's identity so much as the hunt. Jack was one of Jacob's students, but he was always a little unstable, and so Jacob learned the same lesson as the Jedi in Star Wars, that just because an orphan has potential doesn't mean you should give them all the skills of a killer. And somewhere, right around here, is where the DLC goes head over hat stand and spirals into what the hell were they thinking land, because when introducing the DLC, I skipped a bit because I prefer to pretend that it doesn't exist, but unfortunately it does. The DLC actually opens with a level where you play as Jack the Ripper himself and chase Jacob through the streets while menacing words appear all over the place, and there's screen-tearing effects because you're in the head of a madman. There's 3 of these Jack the Ripper missions in the DLC, and I hate all of them. They are incredibly gimmicky, incredibly silly, actively detract from the tone of the story and the pacing, don't even kind of make sense within the framing of the animus, and are just weirdly tone-deaf in the same story that went to so much effort to humanise his victims. It is crazy that the DLC has scenes where Evie, a trained killer, actively recoils from just a glimpse of one of the Ripper's victims to show just how awful and brutal these murders were, to also have scenes that make you partake in that brutality for fun and entertainment. Way to undermine everything you were trying to do, you guys. The first time this happens, it is sort of a good twist because it's all set up like you're going to be playing as Jacob. You even start with Jacob in the loading screen, but then the camera swings around and you're playing as Jack instead. But that little trick is not worth ruining the tone of the entire DLC for. Not to mention, I find his design so stupid. He's just a big man with a bag on his head and a top hat. He looks stupid, and he talks way too much for him to be scary in any way.
Don't you see the irony, brother?
Jack!
Only you know who the Ripper is, but you can't tell a living soul because it would destroy you and the assassins.
Wow, thanks for spelling that out in the most explicit way possible, Jack. I couldn't figure out what was going on my own because I'm a tiny baby. The other missions are even dumber because they're about Jack erasing evidence of himself, but that would be boring, so they're also about going on a manic murder spree of the sort that would absolutely be a massive news story and create dozens of witnesses. I mean, his whole deal is that he only killed prostitutes, primarily prostitutes over the age of 40, and that nobody ever saw him. But then in these missions, he's just killing absolutely everyone right out in the open and relishing in their screams as they run away like an especially silly comic book villain. This is partly due to the game's new fear mechanics because we just hadn't taken quite enough from the Arkham games yet. The game explains that the Indian Brotherhood uses less lethal methods than your usual assassins, relying more on fear tactics to scare people off instead. Evie has learned how to do this and incorporates it into her fighting style. Jack learned to do the same thing during a visit to India with Jacob, but his cool little mix-up on the formula is that he uses the fear tactics and he kills people, thus defying the point of the fear tactics. But, you know, ooh, scary bagface man. We might be taking a step forward in our portrayal of sex workers, but it's 2 steps back in our portrayal of mental health issues. Jack's psychosis is a pop culture nightmare of the first things people think of when trying to portray a crazy person. You know, voices telling you to kill people and shit. That's what the mind of a psycho killer is like. It's all just trauma because he watched his mum get murdered. Also, he was made worse by the asylum because we just needed an itsy bit more Batman cred. There is absolutely nothing new or interesting about this take on Jack the Ripper. He is one of the most generic serial killers ever seen in fiction. Not even being an assassin really matters all that much to his whole deal. He has some vague talk about how he's got the true creed, the true solution, but surprise, surprise, it's to murder everyone because he's a crazy guy. The playable missions as Jack do nothing but ruin the atmosphere of the whole DLC, and I cannot for the life of me figure out what the hell they were thinking when they made them. Is playing as the most famous brutal serial killer of prostitutes in the world really the gimmick you want to sell the DLC with, you guys? The DLC is good, genuinely some of the best stuff in the whole game, but the damage these missions do to the tone is unrecoverable, and that's a real shame. The final scene of the DLC is genuinely great. The Ripper is defeated and Evie finds Jacob beaten but alive. The police start storming the building and Aberlane begrudgingly agrees to cover the whole thing up to protect the twins. It's a great scene. I wish it wasn't in a story about taking down the terrible, terrifying Bagman.
Jacob.
Miss Frye, what the hell happened here?
Nothing, Inspector. Nothing happened here. Trust me. Jack the Ripper's dead.
Inspector!
Now help me, Frederick. No one must ever know that Jack the Ripper was an assassin.
I want those vultures gone this instant, is that clear?
It's over, Jacob. I'm here.
The modern AAA approach increasingly tailors towards this game should be for everyone mentality. We flip from a world where games are made for a mostly white male audience to a world where everyone wants to make absolutely sure that they never do anything that might discourage anyone from playing their games. And that's not an environment for meaningful art, it's an environment for passive fluff. Syndicate's DLCs try to push that boundary a bit, but at the end of the day they still sacrifice it all in the name of vapid fun. Some games should be for everyone. Most games should be for everyone, but not every game needs to be for everyone. We can have a franchise that tackles heavy themes in a realistic manner, a franchise that people understand going in will be uncomfortable sometimes. I wouldn't want every franchise to do that. Sometimes I do just want to have some uncomplicated fun, but I want more from Assassin's Creed because it's shown me before that it can give me more. History was dark and miserable a lot of the time for a lot of people, and by pacifying that element of history, you might make a game that's more fun, but also a game with nothing to say and no meaningful lasting impact. You end up with a middle-of-the-pack game that's unmemorable and unnoteworthy to most people. I'm not mad at Syndicate like I was at Unity, I'm disappointed because I do genuinely really like this cast, and I think if they were given a chance and a real story, they could have been the best in the series. I want to see how Evie deals with a world set up against her. I want to see how Jacob deals with a world set up against his sister. Adding these elements could only enhance these characters. Syndicate could have been amazing, and instead it's just fun. And fun is fine, but fun is fleeting. Fun isn't enough to save a series from creative stagnation. For that, you need a true revolution.
Dame Evie Frye.
Sir Jacob Frye.
Race you to the train.
You're on.
Thank you for watching, and a very special thank you to my wonderful patrons for your continued support. If you'd like to see your name up here, or just support the things that I do, then please consider signing up. It would mean a lot to me, as well as a like, comment, share, subscribe, and ring the bell because someone is in here trying to liberate my child labour force. To see my entire Assassin's Creed series critique, you can click up here, or for something different, my 3-hour retrospective on the Saints Row series is about to cross 1,000 views, and it would be kind of cool if you were a part of it, so you can find that down here.